Thank you all again for joining. So my name is Michael Sisitzky. I am the Assistant Policy Director here with the New York Civil Liberties Union, and I'm really happy to be with you all this afternoon as we are marking 5 years plus a few months since the repeal of one of the worst police secrecy laws in the country, New York Civil Rights Law, Section 50A. Our panel today includes legal experts, advocates, reporters, community leaders who have worked to advance police transparency and to hold law enforcement officials accountable for misconduct. We'll hear about what the repeal of 50A has meant for that work, as well as some of the challenges that remain when it comes to the fight for transparency and oversight, and what comes next after that fight. Just a bit of housekeeping. I'm going to start by providing a brief overview of 50A and the campaign that led to its repeal in the summer of 2020, and then we'll hear from each of our panelists. I've got questions for each of you, but also please feel free to jump in and keep this conversational and interactive with each other as we go along. We'll also reserve some time for audience Q&A. So towards the end, for folks who are watching on Zoom, please put your questions in the Q&A box. We'll be monitoring those as they come in, and we can get those teed up for that portion of the agenda towards the end of our panel discussion. There is a lot to cover, so apologies that I will not be able to do justice to everyone's full biographies here. You'll get to hear from all of them about the work that they've been doing, but I'll just offer some quick introductions for folks so we know who's joining us. So on our panel today, we have Kayla Canne, a reporter with the Democrat and Chronicle. We have Beryl Lipton, the Police Discipline Data Coordinator with USA Today. Jennvine Wong, who's a supervising attorney at the Legal Aid Society. Sammy Sussman, local investigations fellow with the New York Times. Brendan Lyons, managing editor for the Times Union. Dr. Lesli Myers-Small, the executive director of Rochester's Police Accountability Board. And Bobby Hodgson, the assistant legal director here at the NYCLU. Thank you all so much for being on with us this afternoon. So before we get into the panel discussion on what the last 5 years of newfound transparency has meant, I wanted to offer a brief grounding in just how we got here, and then I promise you'll stop hearing from me so much and more from our actual panelists. So what is, or rather what was 50A, and why was its repeal such a major focus for advocates in New York State? 50A was a law that said that all personnel records used to evaluate the performance toward continued employment or promotion of police officers, correction officers, and firefighters were confidential and were not subject to inspection or review. This is in stark contrast to New York's Freedom of Information Law, or FOIL, which operates on the core principle that public records are, in fact, presumptively public, and they should be made available to anyone who requests them. When it was first enacted, 50A was billed as preventing officers from having their credibility undermined during prosecutions by defense attorneys who were armed with access to past unrelated allegations of misconduct that they could use in the course of a trial to discredit an officer on the witness stand. But over time, 50A morphed into something quite different. It turned into this complete barrier to pretty much any access to discipline and misconduct records of police officers, correction officers, and firefighters. First, by court rulings that held that 50A applied when people were seeking to access public records through FOIL requests, and eventually culminating in rulings that basically said if police departments, even if they wanted to release these records on their own, 50A prohibited them from doing so. It was that complete a barrier to any kind of public access to these records. So in practice, the public was completely in the dark about whether police departments and oversight agencies were doing enough or anything at all to investigate and hold abusive officers accountable for misconduct. When we learned about disciplinary and misconduct histories, it was often through leaks to reporters who were relying on whistleblowers to get access to crucial information about whether the officers patrolling people's neighborhoods with a government-issued badge and a gun were wielding their extraordinary power responsibly, or whether they were abusing that power and being shielded from any consequences. So the NYCLU and our partners in Communities United for Police Reform were part of a years-long fight to right this wrong and to call for 50A's repeal. That campaign was led by families whose loved ones had been killed by police and who were fighting for the most basic answers about how and why these systems had failed them and whether the officers who had killed their loved ones would ever be held accountable. Following George Floyd's murder in May of 2020, New Yorkers took to the streets and quickly took up the call to repeal 50A because it became obvious to everyone that if we were going to have conversations around how we change our approach to policing, we need to have access to basic information about what's happening behind closed doors. And in June of 2020, the state legislature passed a series of police reform measures, with the repeal of 50A being the centerpiece of that legislative package. And then the next phase of the work got underway. So with that, and shifting to the next phase of our work, I want to bring in our panel, starting off with Bobby. Bobby, can you talk about what happened following the repeal of 50A, the campaign that the NYCLU launched to get access to police misconduct records, and what that fight looked like once we had to take it to the courts?
Sure. Folks may be shocked to learn that all of these records that had been kept secret for many decades were not suddenly made available to the public as the legislature intended. So I'm going to give a quick overview of some of the more dramatic, I think fascinating, but truly frustrating developments that have sort of happened over the last 5 years, focusing a little bit on in particular on fights we've had in the courts. So as Michael said, the NYCLU in June of 2020, in response to this landmark repeal of 50A, which alongside it also included an amendment of our state's Freedom of Information law, the FOIL law, which affirmatively named and listed the type of law enforcement disciplinary records that would now be presumptively public. The NYCLU, along with many journalists and news organizations, came up with a plan to try and get these documents that had been secret for all these decades. There was obviously a large backlog of them. And we developed, along with our regional partners, our regional offices, our advocates on the ground, our organizers, FOIL requests, so Freedom of Information requests, targeting over a dozen jurisdictions, large and small, police departments, that are as large as the NYPD, but as small as Tonawanda, and everything in between. And we put together pretty comprehensive FOIL requests asking for both the law enforcement disciplinary records themselves, complaint investigations, any materials that departments were putting together, what their systems and structures looked like for engaging in investigations, whether there was such a structure, whether they were keeping track of any sort of facts or figures about, for example, the demographic breakdown of people who are making complaints against the police, where particular complaints are happening. This is all information that we and the drafters of the legislation and the advocates who push for it were really interested in, because it's sort of the first step in, as Michael said, understanding what police accountability even looks like in our communities and in communities around the state. So we put together these FOIL requests and we sent them out to agencies around the state. And with a few notable exceptions, we uniformly got a stonewall. And agencies were not at all interested in sharing their disciplinary records. And what they did, and what we found a pattern developed over the course of the last 5 years, is that police departments themselves, or police unions in particular, went to court. And in the first instance, an agency would either delay or sort of slow roll a response to our request for disciplinary records. But when, as our Freedom of Information law requires, they finally put pen to paper and explained what they were going to do in response to it, they were denying them almost universally, and they were relying on, now that 50A didn't exist, the Freedom of Information law's narrow, very specific exemptions that had sort of, predated 50A, and otherwise, articulate what an agency does not have to turn over in response to a FOIL request. And unsurprisingly, the way they invoked these exemptions is not in alignment with what the exemptions themselves are supposed to cover, is very much out of alignment with a long history of case law saying that agencies can only claim very narrow exemptions and really need to turn over as a sort of baseline matter most material, and then try to redact as little as possible that's covered by an exemption. And the exemptions are supposed to be covering specific material that the public doesn't have access to. So there's an exemption called the privacy exemption, which, when used appropriately, very specifically says that an agency is not going to be turning over things like a person's private medical information, home addresses, phone numbers, email addresses, sensitive material that would expose them, to some sort of invasion of privacy that's unreasonable. That's the standard that the law creates. There are also other exemptions about interagency privilege material, sort of like drafts of things that agencies don't have to turn over, about specific types of law enforcement investigations, and public safety concerns. But again, there's a long history of the Court of Appeals in New York's highest court, saying these are exemptions meant to be interpreted narrowly. And there's also the fact that the legislature itself added language to our Freedom of Information law and a whole section describing law enforcement disciplinary records as something that would be turned over with very specific exceptions. And they enumerated the things that wouldn't be turned over: officers' home addresses, officers' phone numbers, officers' medical records, if those medical records are not relevant to the particular complaint against them. So the legislature thought of this and said, here's the very small amount of material not to be turned over. And then agencies were saying, well, we are going to interpret invasion of privacy to mean anything about an officer where we as a department didn't ultimately discipline them publicly. That's secret material. That's an invasion of privacy to turn over. Nothing has really changed post 50A, and you don't get access to any of it. That was overwhelmingly the response we got from agencies large and small. When the agency itself wasn't making that argument, unions would intervene in cases and make it for them. And the result was we were forced to go to court. We now have over 25 active court cases from the last 5 years, where piece by piece, jurisdiction by jurisdiction, in trial courts across the state and ultimately up to the state's highest court through to our intermediate appellate courts, we had to explain to judges why these agencies were breaking the law now, why the law had changed, what the statute now says, and why these various invocations of the FOIL exemptions really made no sense in light of what the legislature did and the people of New York demanded in terms of transparency. We could talk for 10 hours about all those cases, but I'll cut to the end and the wonderful punchline, which is that in February of this year, we finally got the first cases that made their way up to New York State's highest court, the Court of Appeals. One of them was the NYCLU's litigation against the city of Rochester. Another one was the New York Post's litigation against the NYPD. And they presented sort of complementary questions to the judges about whether these types of materials can ultimately be withheld on the theories that I just described. And in two unanimous decisions, the Court of Appeals said absolutely not. You must be turning these records over. So that's the sort of the overview of what's been happening. It has been a long and very frustrating fight. I think what it's revealed is that agencies are really throwing the kitchen sink and taking every opportunity to delay transparency, to hide historical records and current records of material that has, by law been public or should have been public for the last 5 years. And that only now are, as a result of these long drawn out pieces of litigation, are a lot of agencies finally turning over the first few records. And then I'll just say that the fight is not over. We won these very important decisions from the Court of Appeals, but agencies are continuing in our court cases and in our FOIL requests to say, well, then I'm going to rely on a different exemption that was not discussed by the Court of Appeals, or I'm going to delay my production for a different reason. And so the story is that these fights are happening. We now have some really good case law that requesters around the state can rely on to be getting hopefully records more quickly and to cut off the ability of agencies to be throwing up these obstructive tactics. But right now we are still processing and starting to get this trickle of information that has been happening over the last 5 years in a lot of cases. So I'll stop there. There's a lot more to say about both the law, efforts to try and clarify it and other people's efforts to bring very similar litigation, and then what that actually means for what the public knows. So other people are going to talk a little more substantively about that.
Great. Thanks, Bobby. But it's always good to have a discussion about court cases that kind of universally go in our favor, at least, with those decisions, but lots of twists and turns along the way. Jennvine, I want to bring you into the conversation here. So legal aid has also played a really major role in working towards the repeal of 50A back in 2020, and more broadly in advancing transparency and accountability in New York City. So I'm wondering if you can talk a bit about what your work, what the Legal Aid Society's work has looked like in this arena through the Cop Accountability Project, and how that work has been impacted by the repeal of 50A over the last few years.
Sure, thanks. And a lot of the work that NYCLU has done has also been pretty complementary to our work. I've spent many times calling Bobby and saying, hey, let's talk about this issue. But from legal aid's perspective, we are the largest institutional public defender organization in New York City. And so it has always been a fight to get these records. And our project, the Cop Accountability Project, is an outgrowth from that practice, from our criminal defense practice, from our clients in the criminal defense practice, from our public defense offices across all 5 boroughs. I remember as a new and young trial attorney, just starting out trying cases and having to get information about the cops that were responsible for, my clients' arrests, some of my clients complaining of misconduct, other kind of unconstitutional stops and things like that, and preparing for trial. And part of preparing for trial means you have to be prepared with history of disciplinary histories, misconduct histories for the police officer witnesses in your case. And at the time, we didn't get any of it because of 50A. And even though in these criminal cases, our clients' liberty was on the line, we would get basically black boxes. We would get a wholesale denial, or in the very rare instances where we were able to win in these trial cases to get the court to order disclosure, what we would get is literally, and I do mean this literally, pages that just had black redaction boxes over basically everything. And so it gave us very little information. And so what we had was word of mouth. We had attorneys in our practices that were talking to each other about officers who were found to have lied in their cases, information that they were able to unearth in the defense of one of their clients. And we shared that information, and that information turned into a gigantic unwieldy Excel spreadsheet, which then turned into what is now today our law enforcement lookup. It is just basically a compilation of all of these different sources of misconduct. It was originally things like records that attorneys may have gotten in their individual cases that they were able to share. It was sometimes things like suppression decisions when they were able to win in trial court. Sometimes it was just news articles or records that investigative reporters had shared with us. Sometimes it was records that we were able to obtain through FOIL, of which prior to the repeal of 50A was very few. So that's basically what has been the signature project of the Cop Accountability Project, and it was in service of our trial offices to ensure that criminal defendants had access to police misconduct records in order to be able to really try their case and really be able to test the evidence against them that was being charged against them, right? And so that was the outgrowth of the project. And after the repeal of 50A, what that meant was that, coupled with the criminal discovery reforms in New York, meant that we were expecting basically like an avalanche of records, that our attorneys in all the offices should be getting access to records to help them in defending our clients. But what happened was we were getting stonewalled actually from both sides. In many of the ways that Bobby had already mentioned with respect to the FOIL requests and those kind of public access, public records requests and litigation that was related to that, but also in our criminal cases, we were still unable to get many records. And what that meant is that we were litigating on both fronts, in criminal court and in civil Supreme Court. And the wins on the civil side also meant that we did also get some wins on the criminal side. But on the criminal side, many of these cases, for years, we were just fighting. We were just fighting on individual case by individual case until we were able to get better decisions in the appellate term and then ultimately in the Court of Appeals in order to basically say that we were actually entitled to these records. And now it has become much more accepted that we get these records, but that doesn't mean that we are not without challenges in getting records. And There have been instances where, attorneys will somehow become aware that they have not received records that exist. And some of that is through a law enforcement lookup, or through some sort of, investigative reporting. A media report may have made something apparent that record should have existed. We didn't get it, and then we'll have to challenge it in criminal court. So that in a nutshell is the Cop Accountability Project, and how we have grown and changed and had to adapt in order to answer this growing call to make sure that our clients are able to benefit from actual transparency and be able to use this information in their cases.
Thanks so much. And I think we're noticing a theme here of there being a lot of resistance to lawyers, to public defenders, to advocates getting access to these records. A lot of this built-in drive towards secrecy, police departments not wanting us to have this information. Also probably not wanting to have some of these records reported on in the media. So I want to bring in our crew of reporter friends here. I have a few questions that kind of for the group of our four journalists on the panel to kind of each take up as a group. We can go one by one down the list, or just have this as more of an open conversation. But Beryl, Sammy, Brendan, Kayla, I want to talk a bit about the work that you all have been doing, give you a chance to each talk about your respective projects that you all have undertaken to shine a light on these discipline and misconduct records. Can you talk about what that journey to collect, document, and publish these police disciplinary records has looked like? What kind of the collaboration has looked like, whether with each other or other reporters or folks in communities that you're reporting on, and why you all embarked on that? Why is it so important to be collecting these records and telling these stories? Brendan, I see you off mute. Do you want to kick it off?
Sure, I could speak to that. I think it's important, and one question I saw in the chat too was raised the question of why would we need to know the identity of a police officer or the information about a police officer whose allegations of misconduct were found unsubstantiated or not sustained. And part of the reason is because in many of these departments, at times you had the fox watching the hen house. And so what you wouldn't know if you don't get those records, for instance, is that, and this has happened in the city of Albany and other places we found, that you might have many unsubstantiated allegations by different people against a single officer for the same misconduct. And so that sort of raised the question of, are the departments covering up misconduct at times or not doing a good enough job of sustaining allegations of civil rights abuses? And it also enabled us this year. In February, we published a series looking at police crashes across the state of New York. And because of our ability to access these records, we were able to tell a much fuller story about how departments are undertrained and in many instances allowing officers through discretionary policies to speed through red lights, to drive 100 miles an hour on a highway, in some instances even to use maneuvers to try to force a vehicle off the road. And what we found was that in some cases you had officers who had a pattern of crashes and those types of incidents. And so this has really been able to assist in that. And what we're encountering now is sort of it reminds me of the original statute, which was, it was not what it became. And I know Bobby could speak to this, probably very well, but it was court decisions over the years that expanded 50A and made it much more than what the chief sponsor told us in 2016 was a former Senator Padovan. Was the original intent was simply to prevent attorneys from getting all records on officers and then going at them on cross-examination about things that may have been unsustained. So it was a very narrow reason that 50A was enacted. But then you've seen now, you fast forward to today, and the unwarranted invasion of privacy provision is something that concerns me greatly, because it seems that courts are expanding the definition of that. And just one quick example, and then I'll stop talking, was a former state police superintendent who was forced out of the job a couple of years ago amid allegations that were sustained by the Office of Employee Relations for the governor for sexual harassment allegations. But yet when we foiled his personnel file, which is decades of service, there was not a single mention in those records of any of those complaints. And so what that told me was that they're just withholding them. They are probably, there's no way that they didn't have complaints, but they are determining that since they did not sustain an allegation of sexual harassment, therefore it's an unwarranted invasion of privacy. But because of the ACLU's work and also Legal Aid, I would say that we've come a long way, and I hope that those two decisions by the Court of Appeals in February become a turning point in this issue.
Thanks, Brendan. Beryl, I see you next on my screen. Do you want to talk a bit about some of the work that you've been doing to uncover and report on some of these records?
Of course, yeah. So, yes, following the long fight that eventually gave us access to these records, at the time I was at Muckrock, and we, along with many other Muckrock being a small nonprofit that focuses on helping people file public records requests. And a lot of the work that we did there was very collaborative. And so as soon as the repeal occurred, we were speaking with people in the freedom of information space about what our concerns were about the police response to the repeal. And we were hearing from many people that we were worried that the police departments would delete these records. So obviously there's a strong accountability motivation for requesting the records, but I think the urgency with which we requested records from all of the police departments in New York State was driven by the idea that now that we would be able to get access to these records, they might end up in the trash bin. So with Muckrock, we were speaking with Syracuse University. We were speaking with editors from USA Today Network New York, including from the Rochester Democrat and Chronicle. And we basically spent that weekend following the repeal, submitting FOIL requests to every police department that we could. And much like everybody else, we received a lot of resistance at first. Were sort of called out in a press release from New York State Senator Beryl, who was saying that now that this repeal had happened, people would start using this law and start clogging police departments' abilities to do their work. There were these privacy concerns that came up, concerns about safety that have not borne any fruit, thankfully. And we sort of teamed up to try to get these records, and it has been a long process. A lot of this collaboration has carried on, and thankfully the court cases have started going everybody's way and started really providing some transparency so that we now have access to all of these records. And out of the gate, we really wanted to be able to provide the public access to a lot of these materials, right? You know, the role of the journalist is sort of called out in FOIL as being a representative of the public. And we know that there were many members of the public who were very frustrated, rightfully, because their access to justice and to accountability from the people who were supposed to be protecting us was being thwarted by those very same individuals. So we have been working with Syracuse University's Newhouse School of Journalism and with interns every year, every semester, to sort of go through the records that have been released to us. We've provided and put these into a public-facing database, which now has thousands of misconduct records from around the state. We've been working with some great attorneys at Greenberg Traurig to fight our own FOIL and Article 78 battles. And we've also been able to get some great reporting out of the records that we have and been able to sort of establish some trends within police departments and also just maybe across the policing structure in general. One of our big goals is to help the public sort of engage with these issues. If they've been affected by police misconduct, that's important. But I think all of our communities are affected by failures in police accountability. And so part of our goal is really to help the public to sort of identify some of these problems and to sort of ask some of their own questions about how policing is or isn't working in their community. So these records have been really valuable for that. And happy for Kayla to jump in and talk more about the reporting side of things, or come back around on Kayla.
Yeah, and Kayla, go for it.
Yeah, awesome. So yeah, Beryl and I work very closely together. But a lot of our reporting at the Democrat and Chronicle has kind of come out of this team effort of a bunch of reporters across the state combing through those records, identifying patterns that we're seeing in police behavior, and then looking at how the department or multiple departments have handled it. So really, from my perspective, I think this is about looking at behaviors that would be considered unacceptable if it were me or you doing this, and then looking at, okay, what did it look like for that police officer in my community? Was it handled correctly? Was it, can I trust that my police department is going to discipline someone who does this? So we looked at records that included incidents as minor as like a police officer, scrolling YouTube or watching Netflix during their shift, all the way up to a police officer leaving their department handgun behind in a school bathroom or, at a bar stool. And so, yeah, just chronicling those incidents, making sure the public understands that these are now available for them also to look through, and then holding those departments up to the light and saying, did you handle this correctly? And I think that last question, did you handle this correctly, is a judgment for all of us to decide, not just police departments. It's for communities to decide as well. So.
Thanks, Kayla. Sammy, want to bring you into this. You want to talk a bit about some of the work that you've been doing and what that reporting has looked like? Ooh, Sammy, I don't know if it's just me. I don't think we can hear you.
Sorry about that. Can you hear me now? I
Yes.
think it's always the Bluetooth headphones that catch you. My past this, I guess, was a little bit different. In 2023, I heard from someone who worked for like a DA's office in upstate, and they were saying that with the new discovery laws, some of the smaller DA's offices were being overwhelmed with the amount of state police records that they were getting. They were getting these discs that were just mass compilations of disciplinary records that they had to sort through and then hand over to defendants. And like these small DA's offices didn't really know what to do with that. I don't know how much that's kind of true across the state or if this was one office in particular, but it led me to start foiling to DA's offices to try to get the same bodies of records. So I ended up getting like 10 or 20,000 pages of state police records. I know, like Bobby had, you've had your whole fight with the state police about getting those records, but it's super interesting to me that at the same time that they were saying in court that it would take years and years, if not a decade or more, to, review these records, redact them, and provide them to the public, they were sending these out to DA's offices every 6 months on a compact disc. So I started looking at DA's offices and asking DA's, what Brady records do you have? And then using those to kind of force departments that also were not answering requests to give me records, because I could say, for so many of these smaller departments that had maybe ignored Beryl's requests or earlier requests for these things, going to them and saying, your county DA told me that he has 7 records about misconduct in your department, or she has these 9, complaints that were all substantiated. Can you give me any more? And that seemed to yield a little more, especially when it came to kind of current officers. So I was really focused on current officers and on kind of the DA side. I ended up building kind of a similar database of records across the state and then pursuing similar reporting. I'm now at the times where we're focused a little more on some stories that we can publish with local partners. So trying to find things where like we can publish a leading story. We just did one on like cops who are caught drinking after driving, but are not criminally investigated or arrested at the scene for that by their colleagues or by fellow officers. And we tried to then give, each local case to a local newspaper and do some stories like that, where maybe each, someone in, I don't know, Rochester can read about the officer in Rochester who was caught driving after drinking but wasn't arrested. But then we can write a story about the, 17 something cases across the state where this has happened, something like that.
Great. Thanks, Sammy. I think one more kind of roundtable for our journalist crew. Maybe we can go in reverse order this time. But some of you have noted a couple examples of these, but I wonder if you can talk a bit about some of the impact of what your reporting has looked like in communities. Like, what are these records? What does the reporting say about the state of police accountability in New York? Are there any particular examples or stories that have really stuck with you? And you know, to the extent that you've had conversations with folks on the ground in communities, what's the reception been like to some of the findings that you've been able to uncover and report on? Anyone from our reporter crew want to kick this off?
I can go first if no one else wants to jump in. I had an experience in Chester, the village of Chester, New York. There's also a town of Chester Police Department. The village of Chester Police Department is a very small police department in Orange County. I had foiled them. Some other people have done the same, and they've always claimed that they have no disciplinary records. But I found from the DA that the person who was saying they had no disciplinary records, which was the chief, had been accused of sexual misconduct. He was accused of having an affair with someone and kicking other cops out of the station to invite this woman to join him at the police station. The DA had looked into it, they had substantiated portions of it, but chosen not to charge him. And that piece got a lot of attention locally, as you can imagine. And it was interesting because we saw some changes at kind of the Orange County level of people asking if their chief, you know, if you were in a neighboring town or another town kind of in the same general area, had your chief done the same thing? Or there were a lot of departments in Orange County that weren't turning over these records. And so we saw a lot of movement from people in neighboring communities to question their own departments, which I thought was good to see.
I mean, Brendan, I see you off mute. Do you want to jump in?
Yeah, I think the if you're asking for the reaction from the public and readers, I think it's been positive. But here being based here at the state capitol, I think you also still have concern from lawmakers about what's happening with the courts and how police have interpreted the change in their statute and have tried to sort of say this is what they meant to do and still find a way to withhold records. You know, that's the part that troubles me. But I think overall, when you look at our crash series or other reporting we've done, that people appreciate the deeper look inside the police departments, and sometimes the departments themselves appreciate the ability to say, hey, these are areas we need to improve and that we're working on. And we've seen some legislative response as well to some of the matters that we've reported on. So that's a positive reaction, I would say.
Thanks. Beryl or Kayla, do you want to jump in and add? Yeah, Kayla, go for it.
I don't know if I have anything concrete, but I would say what I hope that the community gets out of this is I hope that they just know and trust that someone's watching. Anytime we have a high profile case with a police officer in Rochester, the first thing I do is background them. I go to our disciplinary records. The Rochester Police Department actually maintains their own public database, so I cross-check it there. And then I file a third, or well, I guess my third course of action is to file an additional FOIL for records in case they got missed somewhere along the way. And that's just to, Brendan alluded to it earlier, that if this officer has multiple complaints against them, there might be something more that we want to look into there. And so, I would just say, I hope that the community knows that because these records are now available, we are able to kind of stay on top of it more and provide more of that accountability that maybe sometimes we weren't able to in the past.
Beryl?
One thing that I really love to see from our project is the feedback that we have been getting from the public when we publish our stories. And of course, there's always a spectrum. There are always going to be people who are very skeptical of our focus on law enforcement and believe that law enforcement are victims of transparency. But we're hearing also, as was previously mentioned, not just from members of the public, but also from officers within departments who do want to see improvements or do know that there were certain instances of misconduct that were not released to us. And so I think that it has been really heartening to get the feedback that we have and to sort of slowly build up the trust. And just as Kayla was saying, really reinforce in our communities, particularly in our communities upstate, because that's where a lot of our reporting takes place. Because I think a lot of individuals in those areas don't necessarily think that there is going to be any accountability coming to their police departments. And, unfortunately, I think we saw with our initial round of requests that we had somewhere between a third and a quarter of police departments that simply ignored our requests altogether. And I think that's obviously a problem with the way that FOIL operates and the accountability mechanisms that exist or don't exist in order to actually enforce proper application of the law. But I think as the public has seen that these are stories that can be told and this is a conversation that they can be a part of, I think we are also seeing a shift in the way that police departments are responding to our new rounds of requests. And so this is really sort of a long game type of an enterprise, as everybody here knows. And I think, having worked that into our regular reporting, we're seeing the growth, and we've written a few stories coming from public feedback. And that's been really nice to see sort of that direct line between our interest and focus on this important topic and the public's comfort with sharing their stories and having their voices be heard after they've suffered from their own experiences with police misconduct.
Right. Thank you all. So we spent a lot of time talking about transparency and access to these records, getting an insight into how these systems work. What we haven't talked a lot about yet is the systems themselves, what kind of powers they have, what the structures look like to actually do the work of holding the officers accountable, the people who are investigating them, the people who are ultimately deciding on discipline. And a few years ago, Rochester tried to do something really creative and overhaul its system of police accountability. So Dr. Myers-Small, I want to bring you into the conversation here. Can you tell us, the Rochester Police Accountability Board, it was, really created with this idea that we would be fundamentally, transforming and improving police transparency and accountability in Rochester. But you all have been facing years of opposition from the local police union and city leadership. So I'm hoping you can tell us a bit about the Police Accountability Board, some of what it's been set up to do, some of the challenges that you all are facing to do more than just advancing transparency, but actually delivering on accountability.
Thank you so much. I just have to start by saying I'm so honored to just be on this panel with everyone and to share perspectives as someone who's like entrenched in the work, really boots on the ground and doing this daily. The Police Accountability Board in Rochester was created because Rochester residents, almost 75% voted and said, you know what? We need to have additional accountability, and we don't feel comfortable, or we don't feel it's enough that the police are policing themselves. And we need another entity that has powers that enable them to impose discipline, that enable them to investigate, and we always are very clear, alleged misconduct of officers, that can do community engagement and interact with the community and let them know what their rights are, and also conduct, do policy work, look at the general order, so the rules and regulations that govern the Rochester Police Department. And so we entered into that territory. I was not the executive director at the time, but immediately, the Locust Club, which is the union for the Rochester Police Department, challenged, and so the disciplinary power was taken away. We were still unique with oversight agencies across the country that we had the ability to investigate alleged misconduct, and so that continued to happen. I took the helm of the Police Accountability Board in Rochester in June of 2024. And we're actually approaching a really important anniversary, if you will. And September 23rd, after conferring with our own internal legal counsel, our general counsel, and deputy executive director, we had outside counsel that we pay for, former president of the New York Bar Association, T. Andrew Brown. We decided, given the fact that 50A was on the table, right, that we would publish the names, right? So before we were publishing, we were redacting the names, and we were also removing any type of hint or indication to who it could be. So pronoun usage was redacted, their rank, right? Because that might give an indication of who the individual was. Well, we ripped the Band-Aid, if you will, and we published names, and we notified, we were very clear and transparent about it. We did have significant pushback from Corporation Counsel, who represents obviously the city of Rochester. You shouldn't do this, not appropriate. But we really felt very strongly about the fact that we had cleared this legally, both internally and with our outside counsel. If you fast forward to April 28th, 2025, we received word that we knew that we were under appeal, that we had lost, and that our investigatory power had been removed. And again, April 28th is forever, that date is forever burned in my memory. And so literally overnight, we had to meet, we had to shift, and we needed to not do that anymore. That ruling is under appeal right now. And, you know, we have NYCLU to thank and others who are helping us, trudge through those waters. But here's the thing. We're not dead, and we are still moving forward under those pillars of accountability and transparency. So what does that mean? We doubled down on getting out into the community, and for some reason, Mother Nature cooperated with us. We had a beautiful summer. We were out. There's a colloquial term that says we're out in the streets. We were out in the streets this summer. We were tabling at cultural events, all different types of events where we were going out and we were informing the community about what we do and what we can't do. And so we're excited. That's extending now into the fall. Guess what? We're pushing into schools, in secondary schools, and we'll be meeting with 6th through 12th graders next month. We're pushing into colleges and universities, and we're going to talk to young people about what their rights are. So that's very exciting, and I think that's really important. The other thing that we doubled down is, so we had to shift, and we call it a quick pivot relative to our former division that was entitled Investigations. We shifted to calling them the Accountability and Transparency Division. And so they have teamed up with our Policy and Oversight Division, and we're looking at trends, at patterns, in systemic issues. We have more individuals can look at that. And, I say this with all due respect and professionalism, but, be careful kind of how things shift. So I would rather have one individual, well, let me say this, I'd rather have no one that is doing anything wrong, but I'd rather have one as opposed to it looking like a pattern or a trend in my organization, right? So now we are looking at records and trying to see, okay, what are patterns that we are noticing that are bringing concern to us? Additionally, and I'm going to pop into the webinar chat. We have a new report that's called From Call to Arrival. So if you pick up the phone and you dial 911, we analyzed how long it takes for law enforcement, Rochester Police Department, to actually get to you. And that has drawn significant interest. When I pop the chat, please go on and look and see what some of our findings are. I'm sure you wouldn't be surprised. A finding was that depending on what your zip code is, the response time is either quicker or longer. And there are other findings. So we're doing those type of either oversight investigations, and we're looking at patterns and practices, because Rochester was so clear years ago relative to the fact that these types of things needed to be followed up and looked at. As I shared, we're under appeal, right? We've appealed the decision of the judge, and so we'll be moving forward in December and having our hearing around that to move forward. The only other thing that I want to share at this time, because I really want to be mindful of airspace, and there's so much, I could take the rest of the time up. We are super excited because on September 30th, we are launching what we're calling a statewide consortium of oversight agencies. And so the 8 agencies, and I believe also Syracuse who's getting their sea legs back, and Buffalo is in process. We're coming together to form a statewide consortium of oversight agencies. And we're going to be discussing everything from governance to how our structure is going to be formatted, some of the challenges that oversight agencies, and the goal is to operate from the perspective of their strength in numbers. And we certainly want to partner with our elected officials to see how we might be able to move forward in a more unified and concerted way. It hasn't been mentioned, but NYCLU, which is our national association, which stands for the National Association of Civilian Oversight of Law Enforcement, they are very excited and supportive. And we're going to the national conference next month. Yeah, we're in September, so October, we're going next month. And we're actually presenting and talking about how our consortium went. But we are very, very excited. We're not daunted about the fact that even though we have significant legal challenges, but we pivot and we are changing given what our legal landscape is. And so we are scrappy, we're fighters. And this work really is important to us individually and collectively. And I'm grateful to have certainly a board that's very supportive. Our city council has been very supportive, and we've been having meetings with some of our local elected officials, and they are very supportive of the work. And we're just going to continue to move forward. And as these challenges come, we're not going to hide. We're not going to just kind of pick up our toys. We're figuring how to evolve and how to still meet the items that are still legally possible for us to do. So that's us in a nutshell, and hopefully that was helpful.
Absolutely. So there's questions that folks have been putting into the Q&A box. I see folks have been answering a good number of those in writing. So definitely take a look at that box there to see how folks have weighed in. We'll have time for a couple more questions, I think, from the audience, but I do want to do one quick lightning round and ask folks to keep it brief. It's going to be a very difficult question to come up with just a quick snippet of a response to. But if you wanted to share one takeaway lesson that you've learned from the work to advance police transparency, or a thought on what tools or other tools are needed to actually improve transparency in New York, what would you want to leave folks with a thought on that? Bobby, I'll come back to you and then I'll run down the list.
My lightning answer is it's going to take a little bit of time, and that the fight is ongoing, but we need to be sort of vigilant, push it forward. And I think we will start to see the fruits of some of these efforts only down the road. And so I think it's really important to keep pushing to get at some of these really important material.
Thanks, Bobby. Jennvine, what have you got for us as a lightning round answer here?
I mean, it's pretty similar. It's just going to take time, and we have to keep pushing, and we can't give up, I mean, I think one thing we've learned over the past, what's now 5 years, from this process is, every win that we are able to achieve does come with backlash. And so we just have to keep pushing.
Kayla, I'm coming to you next.
Yeah, I would bounce off of that and just say that this is just the beginning. We only know a fraction of what we know looking at the records right now. And I feel like they've produced more questions than answers. And then I also think we have a lot still to see in terms of when we get records for unsubstantiated misconduct complaints and other, I've heard of alternative ways that police departments are handling discipline that may not be included in these records. So there's only more to learn.
Thanks. Sammy, you are next up on my screen.
Uh-oh. I think that also, like, I would really urge people to look at their local departments. I think statewide reporters can only do so much. So I'd really urge people, especially smaller departments where it's very hard for a reporter to justify, you know, a lot of time on the ground for a very small department, but there's sometimes really crazy things happening in the smallest department. So just would urge people to look at the departments in their, you know, area and stay very local, and hopefully that leads somewhere.
Great. Brendan?
I think we ought to be looking at firefighters since they were part of it. I'm just kidding. I think I would say one of the things that concerns me that I think that we need to get our arms around, and maybe I don't know if there's a legislative fix for this though, is that we found through our reporting that how these records are kept, what is classified as a disciplinary or personnel record, it varies from department to department, as somebody raised earlier, and that's a big issue. And even the retention period. You know, some departments will have a letter saying, this officer, you did something very bad, we're censuring you for this. And then after 1 year, they put it in the shredder. And so I think that there needs to be some focus on how these records are kept and maintained.
And then Beryl?
I'm just kind of squeeze in answers to both of those. One, I would love to see a stronger teeth and actual enforcement mechanisms when there isn't compliance with FOIL. And I think just in general, just really staying grounded in your good faith motives and not wasting too much energy in that space between reality and what should be. I feel like, especially when dealing with transparency, there's a lot of like, they should respond. The law, you know, should say this. And where we are is just sometimes not where we're supposed to be or where we should be. And that's part of what this project is that we're all working on. And so I think, you know, just underlying what everybody has said about sort of keeping that drumbeat going, because this is going to be a process, even when it feels like, even when there are big wins.
Hey, Dr. Myers-Small, do you want to round us out on this one?
I just would hope that when we talk about accountability and transparency, that it's not automatically equated to anti-police and anti-law enforcement.
Yeah, I think that is a good note to wrap up that round on. You know, I see, you know, one of the questions in the chat to that point is talking about this question of some of the objections from police departments and unions around kind of the impact on officers and potential threats there. I'll say, you know, I remember when shortly after the repeal of 50A, there were some of those objections being raised in litigation here in New York City. And as I recall, you know, the judges looking at that couldn't find any evidence in the records that in states that had misconduct records available to a much greater degree than New York, there was no real correlation between the availability of those records and threats to officers. But I wonder if other folks on the panel have thoughts on that piece and want to jump in.
I can say really quickly. Oh, sorry.
Oh,
Go ahead, Jen.
go ahead.
Okay. You know, that came up that came up then in 2020. It's come up now, and courts continue to find that there is like zero evidence of this claim. No one has put and as Michael pointed out, there are states where this information has been available for decades, and the courts always find it very notable that there's just not an instance of releasing this type of information creating any elevated danger for officers. So there's like, as a factual matter, that's not a thing that's happened. And I think we also point out that they are few and far between, but there are agencies that are affirmatively putting this information out, and they are not putting their officers in danger. They are sort of taking the spirit of this law and saying, yes, the whole point is we think we're proud of our accountability system. We're going to show our work and put it up. You know, the city of Utica, after 50A was repealed, put up all sort of disciplinary records alongside merit and commendation records as part of its public documents, and said, this is how we show our work and show that, in fact, we're proud of the investigation. You know, that doesn't mean that they're all right, but like agencies themselves are doing this affirmatively, and they're not putting their officers in danger.
Yeah, I just wanted to add to that I think there was a case out of LA recently where bunch of activists had like requested photographs of officers, and they got it. They posted it up publicly, and you know, the unions took it to the courts, and the court actually you know, found that there was no increased danger to those officers even in those instances. And so I think we have to think about what is evidence-based here, and the evidence does not show that officers' safety has actually been put at any kind of increased risk just because these records have been made public. And pointing out again, like when we're talking about transparency, we're not talking just about the bad, we're talking about the bad and the good and the whole boodle, basically. So it's really about being able for the public being able to see the entirety of what's happening with these investigations, and ensuring that there is some sort of accountability, that there is process, that things are being done the way that they should be done. And it should be reassuring to members of the public that investigations are being done the way they should. And so officers who kind of complain about it, again, like I say, well, it's not just the bad, it's also the good, the unfounded kind of allegations, those kind of things as well.
Great, thanks. I know we are at the promised time. A lot of the questions have been answered in the chat, so I do want to draw folks' attention. There's some good information that's been put there in the Q&A box on FOIL toolkits, talking about some of the individual requests that have gone in. I will just, as moderator's privilege, note that I think a lot of these questions about individual localities, has there been reporting on some of the records there in New Paltz versus other places? I think, you know, it kind of points to the issue that there is still, even with the repeal of 50A, a lot of work that has now been put on the public's back to actually still get access to these records. So just because they're now available under FOIL does not mean that they're automatically going out there. We're still having to put in these requests. We're still having to fight for them. The NYCLU has been really fortunate to work with a number of law firms who have offered their services pro bono to help us take on the kind of gargantuan task of getting as many of these records from as many police departments as we can around the state. But it really is incumbent on us. So I want to leave folks with the thought that, you know, as we think about other ways to remove some of these barriers to access, what it could look like to think about police departments and other agencies that are kind of proactively making some of these records available as a potential thought for any policy wonks in the audience to chew on. How can we do more to actually put the burden on police departments and oversight agencies to be the ones who are actually giving this information to the public, rather than making us fight through and jump through all of these hoops to get access to this to these badly needed records. With that, I want to thank everyone again for being on the panel. Thank you all for your perspectives, your insight, all of the work that you all have been doing. And thanks so much to everyone in the audience for joining us today and for your questions for the panelists. I hope you all have enjoyed the discussion here.